The letter arrived on a Tuesday. I remember because I had just come in from shoveling the driveway. That wet, heavy Ontario snow that sticks to everything, and I was still pulling off my boots when I saw it sitting on the kitchen counter. My daughter had left it there, just left it there, face up, like it was nothing. It was from the bank, my bank, a notice about a home equity line of credit that had been opened against my property, the house on Lakeview Crescent that I bought in 1987, that I paid off in 2009, that I had lived in for 37 years. I didn't open it right away. I stood there in my socks on the cold tile and I thought, there must be a mistake. There has to be a mistake. There wasn't. But let me back up, because if I just tell you about the letter, you won't understand how we got there. And I want you to understand. I need you to understand. I need you to understand. My name is Gordon. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years working as a structural engineer for a firm in Kitchener, and I retired 4 years ago with a pension, a paid-off house, and what I thought was a good life waiting for me. My wife, Caroline, passed away from cancer 7 years before that. Breast cancer. She was 57. We had one child together, our daughter, Nadia. Nadia was the best thing we ever did, Caroline and I. She was sharp and funny and stubborn in that way that drives you crazy when they're teenagers and makes you proud when they're grown. She got her mother's eyes and my tendency to overthink everything. She studied commerce at Waterloo and met her husband Trevor in her 3rd year. Trevor, I should tell you about Trevor. He was charming when I first met him. That's the word I would have used. Charming. He had a good handshake. He laughed at the right moments. He called me sir for the first 2 years. He worked in real estate development, which in those days seemed impressive. He talked about projects and partnerships and opportunities the way some men talk about hockey, with complete, consuming certainty. I liked him well enough. Caroline liked him more than I did. She said he reminded her of her own father, which I took as a compliment for his sake, though her father had been both generous and deeply careless with money, and I wasn't sure the comparison was entirely good. They got married in 2014, a September wedding at a vineyard outside Niagara-on-the-Lake. Beautiful day. Nadia cried reading her vows. Trevor did not, but I told myself that meant nothing. For the first few years, things were fine. They bought a house in Burlington. They had my granddaughter Lily in 2016. And Lily, I want you to know, is the kind of child who makes you believe the world is going to be all right. She has red hair like nobody else in the family, and she talks constantly, and she makes everything feel lighter. Then the market shifted. Trevor's development project started falling through. One partnership dissolved, then another. He never said much about it directly, but I heard things through Nadia mostly, who would let small things slip and then change the subject. A contractor suing for unpaid work, an investor pulling out, a property that had been sitting unsold for 2 years. I didn't pry. I figured Trevor was handling it. Men like Trevor always assume they're handling it. In 2021, they asked if I would come stay with them for a while. Trevor framed it as them helping me. I had been sick that winter, a bad respiratory infection that knocked me down for 3 weeks, and Nadia was worried about me being alone in the Kitchener house. I said yes. I packed a bag for 2 weeks and I drove to Burlington. That was 3 years ago. The 2 weeks became a month. The month became the winter. And then it was just understood, somehow, that I lived there now. My room was the basement guest room, which had a small window that looked out at the foundation of the garden shed. Nadia brought down extra blankets in November and apologized for the drafts. I told her it was fine. It was fine. But things changed, slowly the way water changes stone. You don't notice it until the shape is already different. Trevor started talking to me differently. Not rudely, not at first, but the warmth left, like a pilot light going out. He would come home from work and not acknowledge me. He would start conversations with Nadia in the kitchen and lower his voice when I walked in. Small things, the kind of small things you tell yourself you're imagining. Then came the comments. Once over dinner, Trevor mentioned his brother-in-law's father had moved into a residence in Oakville. A nice place, he said. Very modern. They do all sorts of activities. He looked at me when he said it. Another time, when Lily spilled juice on my lap and I got up slowly because my hip was bad that week, Trevor said, just quietly, just under his breath, "We can't keep doing this forever, you know." He didn't say it to me. He said it to Nadia. But he knew I heard. I didn't say anything. I'd learned by then to be very quiet. You want to know why I didn't leave? I know that's what you're thinking. Gordon, you're a grown man. You have a pension. You have a house. Why didn't you just leave? Because of Lily. Every morning, Lily would come downstairs and knock on my door and say, "Grandpa, are you awake?" And I would say, "Yes, sweetheart, I'm awake." And she would climb into the armchair by the window, and we would read together before school. Every morning, she was 7 years old and she was reading chapter books, and she would ask me questions about everything. About engineering, about Ontario, about what her grandmother was like. I could not leave Lily. And I think, if I am honest, I also could not fully believe what I was seeing. This was my daughter, Nadia, the child I raised. I kept waiting for her to say something to Trevor, to push back, to tell him to stop. And sometimes she did, quietly, in a way that changed nothing. And then the moment would pass, and everything would go back to the way it was. That winter, I hired an accountant. I told Nadia it was to sort out my taxes, which was true, but it was also because I had started feeling uneasy in a way I couldn't name. I wanted someone outside the house to know my financial situation. I wanted a paper trail that was mine. My accountant's name is Sandra. She has an office on King Street in Kitchener, and she has handled my taxes for 11 years, and she is the most unimpressible person I have ever met, which is exactly what I needed. I told Sandra I was living with my daughter and son-in-law, and I wanted to review everything. My pension, my RRSP, my TFSA, the equity in the house. I wanted to understand, clearly, what I had. Sandra looked at everything, and then she looked at me over her reading glasses and she said, "Gordon, you're sitting on close to $900,000 in equity, and you have a pension that covers your expenses twice over. What exactly are you worried about?" I didn't know how to answer that. "Someone else," I said finally. She understood. It was 2 months after that conversation that the letter from the bank arrived. I stood there in my socks, and I read it 3 times. A home equity line of credit for $220,000, secured against my property on Lakeview Crescent, opened 6 weeks earlier, signed by me. I had not signed anything. I called Sandra that afternoon from my car. I did not want to make the call from inside the house. I sat in my Civic in the Tim Hortons parking lot 2 blocks away, and I told her what the letter said. There was a long pause. "Gordon," she said, "don't touch anything in that house. Don't say anything to anyone. I'm calling my lawyer right now." I drove back to the house, and I made dinner, and I sat across from my son-in-law at the table, and I watched him eat, and I thought about 37 years in that house, and about Caroline, and about Lily upstairs doing her homework, and I felt something settle in me. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and harder than anger. I had been patient enough. Sandra's lawyer was a woman named Patricia who worked in financial fraud and elder law, and she moved with an efficiency that I found deeply comforting. Within 48 hours, she had confirmed that the signature on the loan documents was a forgery. Trevor had used a notarized copy of my signature from a document I had signed years earlier. A consent form for something minor, I couldn't even remember what. And he had lifted it digitally, and applied it to the application. Patricia said it was not as uncommon as people thought. She said it was, unambiguously, fraud. I asked her what my options were. She told me. I chose the one that required patience. Here is what I did not do. I did not confront Trevor. I did not say a word to Nadia yet. I did not call the police, not that week. Here is what I did. I called my cousin Gerald, who is a retired contractor and who has been my closest friend since we were 12 years old, and I asked if I could store some things at his place in Guelph. He asked no questions. Gerald never asks questions when it matters. I began, very quietly, moving things. Not furniture. I wasn't dramatic about it. Documents mostly. The original deed to the house. My investment statements. My grandfather's watch. The photo albums from when Nadia was small. Caroline's letters. I moved them to Gerald's garage over 3 separate weekends, each time telling Nadia I was going to visit him for the afternoon, which I was. Patricia began building the case. She worked with Sandra to document the forgery, to trace where the $220,000 had gone. Because Trevor had already drawn $180,000 of it, it turned out. Most of it had gone to pay off a private lender who had been holding a lien against 2 of his failed development properties. He had been borrowing against my house to cover debts I didn't know existed. I also, during this time, did something I had been putting off for years. I called my old estate lawyer and I updated my will and my powers of attorney. Completely rewrote them. I removed Trevor as an executor. He had been listed there since 2015, which I had never thought much about, until I thought about it very hard, and I replaced him with Sandra and Patricia jointly. I also did one more thing, a thing that felt important. I called the property management company that had been renting out my house on Lakeview Crescent. Yes, I should say I had not sold it. When I moved to Burlington, I had rented it, and I told them I would be resuming occupancy in 60 days. The tenants, a young couple, had already given notice anyway. It was clean. I said nothing in the house. I ate dinner. I watched hockey with Trevor on Friday nights because that had always been our ritual, and I was not going to be the one to break it, not yet. I asked Lily about school. I shoveled the driveway when it snowed, which, this being Ontario, was often. I was learning something about myself during those months. I had always thought of patience as a kind of weakness, waiting instead of doing. But this was different. This was patience as a form of precision. Every day I waited, the picture got clearer, the documentation got tighter, the ground under my feet got more solid. Nadia noticed something. I could see it in the way she watched me sometimes. A slight uncertainty, like she was trying to figure out what had changed. I don't think she knew about the forgery. I genuinely don't. I think she knew Trevor was in trouble. I think she knew he had done things she didn't fully understand. But I don't think she knew her father's signature had been forged. The moment I knew that, truly knew it, was a Tuesday evening in March. I had come upstairs for a glass of water and I heard Nadia and Trevor arguing in the kitchen. The kind of argument where people have stopped bothering to keep their voices down because they've had this argument too many times already. I heard Nadia say, "You told me it was handled. You told me he agreed." I heard Trevor say, "He doesn't need to know the details. It's just paperwork." I heard Nadia say, in a voice that sounded very tired, "Trevor, that's his house." I went back downstairs. I didn't need to hear any more. I called Patricia the next morning. I said, "I'm ready." The process, once it began, was both faster and slower than I expected. Patricia filed a complaint with the police and the bank simultaneously. The bank froze the line of credit immediately. Trevor hadn't yet drawn the remaining $40,000 and began their own investigation. The police were methodical in the way Canadian police are methodical, which is to say, unhurried but thorough. Trevor was questioned on a Thursday. I know because I was at Gerald's in Guelph that day, and Nadia called me at 4 in the afternoon. She was crying before she said a single word. "Dad," she said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." I said, "I know, sweetheart. He used your signature. He told me you had agreed. He said you two had talked about it. He said." Nadia, I should have asked you. I should have asked you directly and I didn't, and I'm so. Nadia, listen to me. Are you at home? She was. Lily was at school. I told her to pack a bag for herself and one for Lily. I told her I was coming. I drove the 401 back to Burlington, and I collected my daughter and my granddaughter, and I drove them to a hotel in Kitchener, near my old neighborhood. I paid for 2 weeks. Then I called my lawyer about the next steps. Trevor moved out of the Burlington house while Nadia and Lily were with me. I don't know exactly what happened in those conversations. Those are not my conversations to tell. What I know is that Nadia retained her own lawyer, and that she and Trevor began separation proceedings, and that the Burlington house went to mediation. What I also know is that the morning the criminal charges were formally laid, I was sitting at my kitchen table on Lakeview Crescent in my own house with a mug of coffee and the sun coming through the window over the sink, and it was so quiet I could hear the birds outside. I had not realized until that moment how long I had been holding my breath. Nadia and Lily moved in with me for a while, a few months, while the legal process sorted itself out. Lily went back to her school in Burlington for the rest of the year, and Nadia drove her each morning, but they slept here, in the rooms I had ready, and every morning Lily knocked on my door and said, "Grandpa, are you awake?" And I said, "Yes, sweetheart," and she climbed into the armchair, and we read together. Some mornings I would watch her and think about Caroline, about how much she would have loved this. Her granddaughter, the red hair, the questions about everything. I would think about the winter I spent in that basement room with the window looking at the shed foundation, and how I had almost convinced myself that was just how things were now. I want to tell you something about my daughter, because I think it matters. Nadia made a mistake, a serious one. She had known something was wrong, and she had chosen not to ask the question whose answer she was afraid of. I understand that. I'm not sure I've always been brave enough to ask those questions either. She was protecting her marriage and her daughter's family, and I think she was also, in some way I'm still untangling, protecting me, as if knowing would have hurt me more than not knowing. But we have talked. Long conversations. The kind we hadn't had since Caroline died. And she has said things to me that took real courage to say, and I have said things to her that I should have said years earlier. About loneliness. About needing to ask for help. About how quiet I had learned to be. We're still learning how to be honest with each other. I think that might be the actual work. Trevor pled guilty to fraud over $5,000, that's the relevant charge under the Criminal Code of Canada, and received a conditional sentence and was ordered to make full restitution. The bank recovered their exposure through the proceedings. I was made whole financially, which Patricia had told me from the beginning was the likely outcome, and which I still found surprising when it actually happened. The Burlington house sold. Nadia and Lily moved into a rental in Kitchener, 3 blocks from me, close enough that Lily can ride her bike over on weekends, which she does, usually without calling first. I have learned to keep snacks in the house. Last September, on what would have been Caroline's 65th birthday, I drove out to the small cemetery east of the city where she's buried, and I sat with her for a while. I told her about everything that had happened, about Trevor and the letter and the months of quiet work and how Lily is doing in school. I told her that Nadia was going to be all right. I don't know if she heard me. I choose to believe she did. I am 68 years old. I have a paid-off house and a pension and a granddaughter who knocks on my door every Saturday morning, and I have learned, late, maybe, but still, that silence is not the same as peace, and that patience used wisely is not the same as giving up. I stayed quiet for a long time because I thought I had no choice, but I stayed patient because I knew exactly what I was building toward. And when the time came, I was ready. I think about that Tuesday a lot. The wet snow on my boots, the letter sitting face up on the counter, the way my first instinct was to make excuses for what I was reading. There must be a mistake. There has to be a mistake. That instinct, the one that reaches for an innocent explanation even when the evidence is sitting right in front of you, I don't think it's weakness exactly. I think it's what happens when you spent a lifetime trying to see the best in people you love. But I've also learned that there's a point where grace becomes complicity, where staying quiet stops being kindness and starts being a kind of slow surrender. Trevor made his choices. Every step he took, the forged signature, the drawn funds, the debts he hid, those were his choices, made deliberately over time. And the consequences that followed were the natural result of those choices. That's not a complicated idea. It's just cause and effect, playing out the way it always does, whether we're watching for it or not. I didn't need to punish him. I just needed to stop absorbing the damage he was causing and let reality catch up to him on its own. What I'm prouder of, if I'm being honest, is what I did in those quiet months between finding the letter and making the call. Because that period tested something in me I wasn't sure I still had. It would have been easy to confront Trevor the night I found out, to make it loud and immediate and satisfying in the way that loud, immediate things sometimes feel satisfying. But that would have been emotion, not judgment. And I'd spent enough of my life confusing the two. Sandra used to say that the best financial decisions are made slowly. I think that's true of most decisions. I moved carefully. I documented everything. I protected what mattered. Lily's stability, Nadia's ability to make her own choices with real information, my own legal standing. I didn't act until I understood the full shape of what had happened. That kind of clarity doesn't come from anger. It comes from sitting still long enough to actually see. And then there's Nadia, my daughter who knew something was wrong and chose not to ask the question whose answer she was afraid of. I've had to think hard about that. About what it means to love someone and still hold them accountable. About the difference between forgiving someone and pretending something didn't happen. We're still working through it, the two of us. There are conversations we've had in the last year that I think we should have had a decade ago, about loneliness, about asking for help, about what it actually means to take care of each other. That work, the honest, uncomfortable, ongoing work of being in a real relationship with another person, that might be the most important thing I've done in all of this. Not the legal case, not the documentation, the conversations with my daughter. I'm 68. I have time to get this right, and I intend to use it. Lily came over last Saturday on her bike, unannounced, the way she always does. She knocked on the door and I opened it and she said, "Grandpa, I'm hungry." Before she even said hello, I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. I went and got her something to eat. That's enough. That's enough.